The summer heat shimmered across the plains of Wyoming Territory. 45 on his hip, still scanned the horizon with the wariness of a man who knew that trouble rarely announced itself before arrival. His destination that afternoon was simply to deliver papers to the county clerk. Ordinary business that required his presence in town. But fate had other plans for the former lawman. I'd like to kindly ask you to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. I'm curious, what city are you watching from today? Promise Creek had grown considerably in the 4 years since the railroad had come through. What had once been little more than a dusty crossroads with a saloon and general store now boasted a proper main street, lined with false-fronted buildings, a hotel, a bank, and even a small opera house that doubled as a church on Sundays. The town owed much of its prosperity to the silver mine in the nearby hills and the cattle drives that passed through seasonally. Today, the street bustled with the usual activity: ranch hands loading supplies into wagons, ladies in their finery making social calls, and the occasional drunk staggering out of the Silver Dollar Saloon despite the early hour. Jeremiah tied his horse at the hitching post outside the courthouse, a sturdy 2-story brick building that stood as a testament to the town's ambitions. The familiar weight of his boots on the wooden sidewalk brought back memories of his days enforcing the law, of walking these same boards with authority and purpose, rather than just as another citizen with business to attend to. Inside the courthouse, the air was mercifully cooler than the scorching heat outside. The clerk's office was located at the end of a narrow hallway, its door standing partially open. Jeremiah adjusted his hat and straightened his vest, a habitual gesture before entering any official space. He heard voices from within, raised voices, and his lawman's instincts immediately put him on alert. One belonged to Judge Henry Blackwood, the circuit judge who'd arrived in town the previous day. The other, higher and strained with emotion, was unmistakably that of Victoria Thornton, the wealthy widow who owned the largest cattle ranch in the territory. Jeremiah hesitated, not wishing to intrude on what sounded like a heated private discussion, but his hand had already pushed the door slightly wider before he could stop himself. Through the gap, he could see the judge's flushed face as he gripped Victoria's wrist with one hand, the other holding what appeared to be a folded document. "This is the last time I'll say it, Victoria," the judge hissed, his voice low but intense. "Sign the transfer deed, or I'll make sure everyone knows about your husband's dealings with the Indians." How do you think your precious society friends would react to learning Thomas was selling weapons to the Sioux? How many settlers died because of those rifles? Victoria's face had gone pale, her normally composed features twisted in a mixture of fear and defiance. "You wouldn't dare," she whispered. "You were his partner in that venture. Your signature is on those papers too." The judge's laugh was cold and without humor. "My dear, who would believe you? A grieving widow making wild accusations against a respected judge? Besides, those papers no longer exist." At that moment, Judge Blackwood's eyes flicked toward the door and locked with Jeremiah's. The judge's expression shifted instantly, from threatening to startled, then carefully neutral, but it was too late. Jeremiah had seen what no one was meant to see, had heard what no one was meant to hear. The silence that followed stretched like a taut wire between them. Jeremiah stood frozen in the doorway, his hand still on the knob, as Judge Blackwood slowly released Victoria's wrist. The widow turned, her emerald eyes widening in recognition as she saw the former marshal. For a moment, no one spoke, the only sound being the distant tick of the grandfather clock in the main hall and the muffled noise of town life filtering through the windows. Then the judge cleared his throat, adjusting his suit jacket with practiced casualness. "Marshal Foster," he said, addressing Jeremiah by his former title with deliberate emphasis. "I didn't realize you were there. Mrs. Thornton and I were just concluding some legal matters." Victoria had recovered her composure with remarkable speed, though her eyes held a desperate intensity as she stared at Jeremiah. "Yes, just business," she echoed, her voice steady despite the slight tremor in her gloved hands. "Nothing that would interest anyone else." Jeremiah tipped his hat slightly, his face betraying nothing of the turmoil within. 20 years of law enforcement had taught him when to speak and when to hold his tongue. This moment called for the latter. "Judge, Mrs. Thornton," he acknowledged with a nod, "I've come to file some breeding records with the clerk. I can come back later if you're still conducting business." The judge waved a dismissive hand, his smile not reaching his eyes. "Not at all. Mrs. Thornton was just leaving. Weren't you, my dear?" Victoria gathered her skirts, her chin lifting in a gesture of dignity that couldn't quite mask her distress. As she passed Jeremiah, her perfume, lavender and something deeper, more expensive, filled his nostrils. Their eyes met for the briefest of moments, and in that instant, Jeremiah saw a silent plea in her gaze, a desperate request that he pretend he'd seen and heard nothing. Then she was gone, the rustle of her silk dress fading down the hallway. Judge Blackwood's demeanor changed the moment Victoria's footsteps could no longer be heard. The false cordiality vanished, replaced by a cold, calculating stare that Jeremiah had seen many times before, in the eyes of men who believed themselves above the law. "Foster," the judge said, his voice low and measured, "I hope I can trust your discretion regarding what you may have overheard." Private legal consultations between a judge and a citizen are privileged information. Jeremiah met the judge's gaze steadily, his expression neutral. "I'm just here to file some papers, Your Honor. Not my business to comment on other folks' affairs." The judge studied him for a long moment, as if trying to determine whether Jeremiah could be trusted or whether he might become a problem. Finally, he nodded, though his eyes remained cold. "Good. I'd hate to think a respected former lawman might spread unfounded gossip. That sort of thing can damage reputations, careers, even lives." The threat was thinly veiled, but Jeremiah simply nodded in acknowledgement. The rest of Jeremiah's business at the courthouse passed without incident, though he could feel the judge's eyes on him as the clerk recorded his documents. When he finally stepped back out into the harsh sunlight of Main Street, Jeremiah found his thoughts returning to the scene he'd witnessed. Thomas Thornton had been a powerful man in the territory, his Rocking T Ranch employing half the county. His sudden death from a heart attack 6 months ago had left his much younger wife in control of an empire, though rumors had swirled that Victoria was struggling to maintain the ranch against pressure from various parties interested in acquiring the prime grazing land. Now it seemed Judge Blackwood was one of those parties, and he was playing a game far outside the boundaries of the law. Jeremiah untied his horse and swung up into the saddle, intending to head straight back to his modest ranch. He had no desire to get involved in whatever scheme was unfolding between the judge and the widow. As Jeremiah guided his horse down the main street, he noticed a familiar figure standing outside the general store. Sheriff Will Taylor, a friend from his days as a marshal. The younger man raised a hand in greeting, and Jeremiah reined in his horse. "Afternoon, Will," he said, tipping his hat. The sheriff grinned up at him. Jeremiah, haven't seen you in town for weeks. How's the horse breeding business treating you? Jeremiah shrugged, allowing a small smile. Can't complain. Better than chasing outlaws in this heat. They exchanged pleasantries for a few moments, before the sheriff's expression grew more serious. Say, you hear about the trouble at the Rocking T? 2 hands found dead last week, shot in the back while checking the north pasture fence line. Victoria Thornton's offering a reward for information. Jeremiah felt a cold sensation settle in his gut. No, hadn't heard. Any leads? The sheriff shook his head. Nothing solid. Some say it might be rustlers. Others think it could be connected to the boundary dispute with the Morrison spread. The information settled uneasily in Jeremiah's mind as he continued his ride home. The 2 dead ranch hands, the pressure on Victoria Thornton to sign over land, the judge's threats, they formed a pattern that his experienced eye couldn't ignore. Still, he told himself, it wasn't his problem anymore. He'd served his time upholding the law. Now he bred horses and minded his own business. By the time he reached his modest ranch house nestled at the foot of the western hills, the sun was beginning to sink toward the horizon, painting the landscape in gold and amber. His ranch hand, a youngster named Billy Jenkins, took his horse as Jeremiah dismounted. Any trouble in town, Mr. Foster? The boy asked, always eager for stories of excitement. Jeremiah shook his head. Just the usual, Billy. Nothing worth mentioning. But as he walked toward his house, he couldn't shake the image of Victoria Thornton's eyes, filled with fear and desperate appeal. Night had fallen over the Wyoming Territory, bringing with it a coolness that was a blessed relief after the day's heat. Jeremiah sat on his porch, nursing a glass of whiskey and watching the stars emerge one by one in the vast canvas of sky. His thoughts kept returning to the scene at the courthouse, to the judge's veiled threats and Victoria Thornton's silent plea. He was considering turning in for the night when he caught sight of movement at the edge of his property, a rider approaching at a steady pace. Instinctively, his hand moved to the colt at his side as he set down his glass and rose to his feet. Few people came calling after dark in this country, and most of those who did brought trouble with them. The rider drew closer, silhouetted against the starlit prairie, and Jeremiah could make out the smaller frame of a woman, her riding skirt billowing slightly in the night breeze. As she came into the pool of light cast by his porch lantern, he recognized the elegant features of Victoria Thornton. She reined her horse to a stop and dismounted with practiced grace, despite her fine riding clothes. Up close, Jeremiah could see that her face was pale with exhaustion, dark circles shadowing her eyes. "Mrs. Thornton," he said, tipping his head in greeting. "It's late for a social call." Her laugh was brief and without humor. "This is hardly social, Mr. Foster." She glanced around nervously, as if expecting to find someone watching from the shadows. "May we speak inside?" Jeremiah hesitated only briefly before nodding and gesturing toward the door. His home was simple but neat, a far cry from the opulence of the Rocking T mansion, but comfortable enough. He lit a lamp as Victoria removed her riding gloves, revealing slender fingers adorned with only a single gold wedding band. "Can I offer you something? Coffee? Something stronger?" She shook her head. "No, thank you. I can't stay long. If anyone realizes I've come here..." She left the thought unfinished. "You're here about what happened at the courthouse," Jeremiah stated, rather than asked, moving to stand near the stone fireplace. Victoria's green eyes met his directly, her composure restored now that they were away from prying eyes. "Yes, I need to know what you intend to do with what you overheard." Jeremiah considered his words carefully. "I'm not a marshal anymore, Mrs. Thornton. What passes between you and the judge isn't my concern." She studied him, her gaze unflinching. "But you were concerned enough to listen at the door." He felt a flash of irritation at her accusation. "I wasn't eavesdropping, ma'am. I came to file papers and happened upon a conversation that didn't sound entirely friendly." Victoria sighed, removing her hat and placing it on the table. Without it, with her dark hair falling loose around her shoulders, she looked younger, more vulnerable. "Judge Blackwood is trying to force me to sign over the water rights to Silver Creek," she said after a moment of silence. "It runs through the north part of my property. Without it, half my grazing land becomes worthless." Jeremiah nodded slowly. Water rights were precious in this territory, often more valuable than the land itself. "And the business about your husband selling weapons to the Sioux?" Victoria's expression hardened. "My husband did many things I didn't approve of, Mr. Foster. That was one of them. But Henry Blackwood was his partner in that venture, as I told him. They made a fortune selling repeating rifles to the tribes just before the Red Cloud War." Jeremiah felt a surge of anger. He'd lost friends in that conflict, good men who'd never stood a chance against warriors armed with modern weapons. "That's a serious accusation against a sitting judge, Mrs. Thornton." "I have proof," she replied, her voice steady. "Thomas kept ledgers, contracts, and letters from Blackwood. That's why the judge wants control of Silver Creek. Not just for the water, but because there's a cave on that property where Thomas hid the documents." Jeremiah paced to the window, looking out at the darkness. "If what you're saying is true, why not take this to the territorial governor or the federal marshals?" Victoria's bitter laugh stopped him. "With what evidence? The papers are hidden, and I need time to retrieve them. Meanwhile, it would be my word against a respected judge. And now—" She faltered for the first time. "Now my ranch hands are being killed. 2 men shot in the back last week. Good men with families." The cold feeling in Jeremiah's gut intensified. "You think the judge is behind that?" She nodded grimly. "I know he is. He's growing impatient. The next supply train to the northern reservation leaves in 2 weeks. He has a shipment of rifles to deliver, just like in the old days." Silence fell between them as Jeremiah processed this information. Finally, Victoria rose from her seat, moving toward him with deliberate steps. "Mr. Foster, I need your help. I need time to retrieve those documents without the judge suspecting. I need protection." She was close enough now that he could smell her perfume again, could see the flecks of gold in her green eyes. "I'm just a horse breeder now, Mrs. Thornton. If you need protection, the sheriff—" She cut him off. "The sheriff is a good man, but he's young and inexperienced, and Judge Blackwood has the ear of every official in the territory. You were a U.S. Marshal for 20 years. You have experience, judgment, and nothing to prove." Her hand came to rest lightly on his arm. "I can make it worth your while. Name your price. Money, land, horses for your breeding program, anything." The implication in her tone, in the way her eyes held his, suggested she might be offering more than material compensation. Jeremiah stepped back, breaking the contact. "I'm not for sale, Mrs. Thornton." To her credit, she didn't flinch at his rebuff. Instead, her chin lifted slightly in that gesture of dignity he'd noticed earlier. "Everyone has a price, Mr. Foster. I'm simply trying to discover yours." He met her gaze steadily. "Let's say I believe your story. Let's say I even agree to help. What exactly do you think I can do against a judge with the influence you describe?" Victoria turned away, moving toward the fireplace, her profile outlined in the soft glow of the lamp. "I need 3 days to retrieve the documents. 3 days during which the judge must not suspect I'm moving against him. Your presence at my ranch, publicly, as a guest, would provide cover for my absence from the main house while I search. The judge knows your reputation. He won't risk moving openly against me if you're there. And the real reason you came to me instead of hiring guns? Jeremiah asked, sensing there was more to her request. Victoria's expression grew more solemn. Because you saw his face when he thought no one was watching. You heard his threats. And because in this territory, your word still carries weight. If something happens to me, I need someone who can testify to what they saw and heard. The practicality of her reasoning struck Jeremiah forcefully. She wasn't just looking for protection. She was securing a witness. 3 days, he said finally. No payment, but I want the full story. Everything about your husband's dealings with the Sioux. Everything about the judge's involvement. If I'm putting my neck on the line, I want to know exactly what for. Relief flooded her features, though she quickly composed herself. Thank you. I'll send a carriage for you tomorrow morning. We can discuss the details then. As Victoria prepared to leave, gathering her hat and gloves, Jeremiah felt compelled to ask one more question. The men who were killed, your ranch hands, were they involved in this business with the documents? She paused at the door, her expression darkening. No, they were innocent men who happened to be working too close to the cave where the papers are hidden. The judge's hired guns likely killed them as a warning to me. The confirmation of his suspicions left a bitter taste in Jeremiah's mouth. He helped her mount her horse, then watched as she rode away into the darkness, her figure gradually disappearing into the vast Wyoming night. As he turned back toward his house, Jeremiah knew he'd just stepped back into the world he'd left behind 3 years ago. A world of danger, violence, and moral ambiguity. Only this time, he wore no badge to guide his actions or justify his choices. True to her word, Victoria sent a carriage the following morning, an elegant black lacquered affair drawn by a matched pair of bay horses that spoke of the Thornton wealth. Jeremiah packed lightly, bringing only what he might need for a few days away, a change of clothes, extra ammunition for his Colt, and a Winchester rifle that had served him well during his martial days. He left instructions with Billy to tend to the horses and property in his absence. The young man's eyes had widened with excitement at learning his employer was bound for the famous Rocking T Ranch. But Jeremiah offered no explanations beyond a vague reference to business matters with the widow Thornton. The journey to the ranch took just over an hour, the carriage following the main road before turning onto a well-maintained private drive marked by an imposing wooden arch bearing the Rocking T brand. As they crested a gentle hill, the ranch headquarters came into view, an impressive 2-story main house built of locally quarried stone, surrounded by various outbuildings, corrals, and bunkhouses that housed the operation of one of the territory's largest cattle spreads. Jeremiah was met at the entrance by a well-dressed man who introduced himself as Parker, the house steward. Mrs. Thornton is attending to some business matters, but asked me to show you to your quarters, Mr. Foster, the man explained, leading Jeremiah into a house that reflected Thomas Thornton's success and ambition. Fine carpets from back east covered polished wooden floors. Oil paintings in gilded frames adorned walls paneled in dark wood. Furniture crafted by skilled hands filled rooms designed to impress visitors with the owner's prosperity and taste. Jeremiah felt distinctly out of place in his simple clothes and dusty boots, but he followed Parker up a sweeping staircase to a guest room on the second floor that was larger than his entire cabin. Mrs. Thornton has arranged for you to dine with her this evening, Parker informed him. In the meantime, She suggested you might wish to familiarize yourself with the ranch. Martin, our foreman, can provide you with a mount if you'd like to ride out. After washing away the dust of travel, Jeremiah did indeed take the opportunity to explore the rocking T. Mounted on a spirited chestnut gelding provided by the ranch foreman, he rode out across rolling grasslands where fat cattle grazed in numbers that impressed even his experienced eye. The operation was clearly well managed, with fences and buildings maintained to a high standard despite the recent change in leadership. As he rode the property lines, Jeremiah kept a watchful eye out for any sign of the cave Victoria had mentioned, but the ranch was vast, nearly 50,000 acres, according to Martin, and she had provided no details about its location. He did, however, note the presence of Silver Creek, a substantial waterway that cut through the northern section of the property, providing life-giving moisture to the surrounding rangeland. The value of its water rights was immediately apparent to anyone familiar with ranching in this arid territory. By late afternoon, Jeremiah had circled back to the main house, having seen no suspicious activity, but gaining a better understanding of the ranch's layout. He was brushing down his mount in the stables when he became aware of another presence. Turning, he found himself face to face with a man he recognized from town, Samuel Reed, a gunslinger whose reputation for violence preceded him. Reed leaned against a stall door, toothpick between his teeth, his right hand resting casually near the revolver on his hip. "Well now, if it ain't the famous Marshall Foster," he drawled, a mocking smile playing at his lips. "Heard you'd retired to raise horses. Didn't expect to find you here at the rocking T." Jeremiah continued brushing the gelding, his movements unhurried despite the tension crackling in the air. "Don't believe I'm answerable to you, Reed. Last I checked, Mrs. Thornton chooses her own guests." Reed's smile widened, though it never reached his cold eyes. "Course she does. Just making conversations, all friendly-like." He shifted slightly, and Jeremiah noticed for the first time that Reed wore a deputy's badge on his vest. Following his gaze, Reed tapped the star with one finger. "Sheriff Taylor deputized me last week. Judge's orders, what with the killings and all. I'm here providing official protection to the widow." The news settled like a stone in Jeremiah's stomach. If Reed was now a deputy, operating under Judge Blackwood's influence, the situation was even more precarious than Victoria had suggested. "Well then," Jeremiah replied evenly, "seems Mrs. Thornton has plenty of protection without me. I'm just here on private business." Reed studied him for a long moment before pushing away from the stall door. "Private business, sure." He turned to leave, then paused, glancing back over his shoulder. "Word of advice, Foster. This ain't your jurisdiction anymore. Best remember that before you start poking around in matters that don't concern you." Dinner that evening was served in a formal dining room, adorned with crystal chandeliers and silver candelabras that cast a warm glow over the polished mahogany table. Victoria had changed from her daytime attire into an emerald gown that complemented her eyes and emphasized the elegant curve of her shoulders. With her dark hair arranged in an elaborate style and diamonds at her throat, she looked every inch the wealthy widow, poised, beautiful, and utterly in command of her surroundings. Yet as the servants placed the first course before them and withdrew, Jeremiah noticed the slight tension around her mouth. The way her eyes darted occasionally to the closed dining room doors. "I see you've met our new deputy," she said once they were alone, her voice low despite the privacy. "Samuel Reed is Judge Blackwood's man through and through. The badge is just for show." Jeremiah nodded, keeping his voice equally quiet. "I gathered as much. Does Sheriff Taylor know what kind of man he's deputized?" Victoria's laugh held no humor. Will is a good man, but naive. The judge convinced him Reed's experience with a gun would help solve the murders. In reality, it places the killer right here, watching my every move. She took a sip of wine, her composure perfect, despite the danger she described. Reed follows me everywhere I go on the ranch. That's why I need you to create a diversion tomorrow. I need to reach the cave without him shadowing me. Jeremiah leaned forward slightly. You still haven't told me where these documents are hidden, or how you plan to retrieve them without being noticed. Victoria glanced toward the door again, before responding. The cave is in the northern section, near where Silver Creek cuts through a ridge of limestone. The entrance is hidden behind a fall of rock that looks natural, but can be moved aside. And the diversion? Jeremiah prompted. Victoria met his gaze directly. Tomorrow morning, I need you to announce that you're concerned about the security of the ranch perimeter. Insist on riding the boundary lines yourself, and request that Reed accompany you since he's now an official deputy. He won't want to let you out of his sight anyway, suspecting as he does that you're here to help me. She leaned closer, lowering her voice further. While you keep him occupied, I'll retrieve the documents. By nightfall, we should have the evidence needed to bring Judge Blackwood to justice. The plan seemed straightforward enough, though Jeremiah had learned through bitter experience that simple plans often went awry in execution. And if Reed refuses to accompany me, if he insists on staying close to you instead, Victoria's expression hardened. Then we improvise, Mr. Foster. But I'm counting on your reputation and his suspicion to make him follow you. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of the main course, carried in by Parker and a young serving girl. Jeremiah noticed how the steward's eyes lingered on Victoria with an expression of concern before he withdrew again. Once they were alone, Victoria's demeanor changed subtly, her voice taking on a more conversational tone as she asked about his horse breeding business. Jeremiah understood the shift. They were establishing a plausible reason for his presence at the ranch, should anyone be listening at the doors. They spent the remainder of the meal discussing bloodlines and breeding strategies, the widow displaying a surprising knowledge of horseflesh that suggested her interest in acquiring stock from him might not be entirely a cover story. Only as they finished their after-dinner coffee did Victoria return briefly to the real matter at hand. Be careful around Reed, she warned softly. He's killed 11 men that I know of, and he won't hesitate to add a former marshal to his tally if he senses a threat. Jeremiah retired to his room shortly thereafter, but sleep proved elusive. He stood at the window, looking out over the moonlit expanse of the Rocking T Ranch, his thoughts troubled by the complexity of the situation he'd entered. Victoria Thornton was clearly in danger, and Judge Blackwood's abuse of power and involvement in gun running demanded justice. Yet something about the widow's story nagged at him. Small inconsistencies, details left unexplained. Why had she waited 6 months after her husband's death to retrieve these incriminating documents? How had she discovered their location if Thomas Thornton had hidden them so carefully? And most troubling of all, why had she really sought him out specifically when hired guns would have provided more effective protection? As a light rain began to patter against the window pane, Jeremiah decided that whatever Victoria's full motives might be, his course was clear. Tomorrow, he would play his part in her plan, but he would keep his eyes open for any sign that there was more to this situation than she had revealed. Morning brought clear skies and a sense of tension that seemed to permeate the very air of the Rocking T. Jeremiah joined Victoria for breakfast on the veranda, where their conversation could be easily overheard by the servants, and undoubtedly by Reed, who had positioned himself at the corner of the house with a clear view of their table. Though I'd feel better if you didn't go alone, given what happened to my men. Right on cue, Reed sauntered over, thumbs hooked in his belt. I couldn't help overhearing. If you're planning to inspect the boundary lines, I'd better come along. Sheriff's orders, no one rides alone until we catch these killers. The gunslinger's eyes narrowed suspiciously as he looked between them. Besides, Mrs. Thornton has appointments in town today. Judge Blackwood is expecting her at the courthouse by noon. Victoria's surprise seemed genuine, at least to Jeremiah's practiced eye. I have no such appointment, she replied coolly. Reed's smile didn't reach his eyes. Message came this morning while you were still dressing, ma'am. Parker has the carriage being prepared now. Jeremiah could see the momentary flash of alarm in Victoria's eyes before she composed herself. Their plan was already unraveling. If she was forced to go to town, she couldn't search for the documents. And if Reed insisted on escorting her rather than Jeremiah, the entire diversion would fail. I'm afraid the judge will have to reschedule, Victoria said firmly, rising from her chair. I have pressing matters here on the ranch today that cannot be postponed. You may inform him of my regrets when you ride the boundary with Mr. Foster. Reed's expression darkened. Ma'am, the judge was quite insistent that... Victoria cut him off with a gesture. Mr. Reed, I believe I am still mistress of this ranch. I will decide my own schedule, not Judge Blackwood. Now, if you would be so kind as to saddle 3 horses, you will accompany Mr. Foster on his inspection, and my foreman, Martin, will escort me on my own business today. For a moment, Jeremiah thought Reed might refuse outright, might reveal whatever authority the judge had given him over Victoria's movements. Instead, the gunslinger's face settled into a cold mask. As you wish, Mrs. Thornton, but the judge won't be pleased. An hour later, Jeremiah found himself riding the northern boundary of the Rocking T, with Samuel Reed following a few paces behind. The gunslinger's mood had not improved, and he made no effort at conversation as they checked fence lines and scanned the surrounding terrain for any sign of intruders. Victoria had ridden off in the opposite direction with Martin, ostensibly to check on a sick calf in the southern pasture. In reality, Jeremiah knew she was circling back toward the limestone ridge and the hidden cave. The deception seemed to be working for now, but Reed's evident suspicion and the unexpected summons from the judge suggested that their window of opportunity might be narrower than anticipated. As they crested a rise that offered a view of the winding path of Silver Creek, Jeremiah reined in his mount. Water rights to that creek would be valuable, he commented, breaking the silence. Especially if someone was planning to dam it upstream. Reed grunted non-committally, but Jeremiah noticed the way his gaze sharpened. Just making conversation, Jeremiah added mildly. Though it seems odd that a judge would be so interested in ranch land. Law books pay better than cattle these days. The provocation was deliberate. Jeremiah wanted to gauge how much Reed knew about Blackwood's plans. The gunslinger spat into the dust before responding. Don't know what you're talking about, Foster. And if you're smart, you'll stop asking questions that ain't your business. Jeremiah turned in his saddle to face Reed directly. When someone uses their position to threaten a widow, that makes it my business. Same goes for shooting ranch hands in the back. Reed's hand drifted closer to his revolver, his eyes cold. You calling me a murderer, old man? That badge you used to wear won't stop a bullet. No, Jeremiah agreed calmly, but neither will that one you're sporting now. Deputy Starr doesn't give you the right to kill innocent men or intimidate women. Reed's laugh was harsh. Innocent? Lady Victoria ain't as innocent as she plays, and neither was her husband. You think Thomas Thornton built this ranch honestly? Man had blood on his hands from here to the Canadian border. The revelation wasn't entirely surprising. Few fortunes in the territory had been amassed without some measure of violence or corruption. but it added another layer to the complex situation. "And the judge?" Jeremiah pressed. "What's his interest in all this?" Reed's expression closed off. "Like I said, questions that ain't your business. Now, are we riding this fence line or not? I got better things to do than babysit an ex-lawman playing cowboy." They continued their inspection in tense silence, gradually working their way around the perimeter of the vast ranch. By mid-afternoon, they had covered the northern and western boundaries and were turning east when Jeremiah spotted a plume of dust in the distance, riders approaching fast from the direction of town. Reed noticed it too, his expression darkening. "Looks like the judge got tired of waiting," he muttered, almost to himself. Jeremiah counted at least 4 riders, their silhouettes growing clearer as they drew nearer. The lead rider was unmistakably Judge Blackwood himself, his portly figure distinctive even at a distance. Beside him rode Sheriff Taylor, looking uncomfortable, and behind them came 2 hard-faced men Jeremiah didn't recognize, but instantly identified as hired guns by their bearing and the way they carried their weapons. The situation was escalating rapidly, and Victoria was still somewhere on the property, possibly in the cave with the very documents that could destroy Blackwood. "Foster!" the judge called as they approached, reining in his horse with a cloud of dust. "What a surprise finding you here. Paying a social call on the widow?" His tone was jovial, but his eyes were cold as he glanced between Jeremiah and Reed. The deputy straightened in his saddle. "He says he's here to buy horses, Judge. Been riding the boundary with me all morning." Sheriff Taylor looked genuinely confused. "Jeremiah, I didn't know you were in the market for Thornton stock." Jeremiah met the younger man's gaze steadily. "Just exploring options, Will. Mrs. Thornton has some fine bloodlines that might improve my breeding program." Judge Blackwood's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Indeed, Victoria has many fine assets. Speaking of our dear widow, where might she be? We have urgent business to discuss." "South pasture," Reed answered before Jeremiah could speak. "Checking on some sick cattle with the foreman. Should be back at the main house by now." The judge exchanged glances with his hired guns before turning back to Jeremiah. "Well, we won't keep you from your inspection. Reed, you come with us back to the house. Foster can find his own way." It was a dismissal, and a dangerous one, separating Jeremiah from whatever was about to happen at the main house. He couldn't allow that. "Actually, we were just heading back ourselves. Found some damaged fencing on the north line that needs reporting." The judge's expression hardened momentarily before he forced another smile. "By all means, then. Let's ride together. I'm sure Victoria will be pleased to see us all." The implication was clear. Blackwood suspected something was amiss, and he was ensuring that Jeremiah would be under watch. The ride back to the ranch headquarters was tense, with Jeremiah positioned between Reed and one of the judge's gunmen, effectively a prisoner without being openly treated as one. Sheriff Taylor rode ahead with the judge, engaged in conversation that Jeremiah couldn't overhear. His mind raced, trying to calculate how much time Victoria might need, whether she had found the documents yet, whether she had made it back to the house ahead of them. As they crested the final rise and the Rocking T's main house came into view, Jeremiah felt a surge of relief at the sight of Victoria's distinctive bay mare tied at the hitching post. She had returned, but had she been successful? The answer came sooner than expected. As they rode into the yard, Victoria herself emerged onto the porch, her riding clothes dusty, but her posture erect and confident. Something in her bearing, in the set of her shoulders and the tilt of her chin, told Jeremiah that she had found what she was looking for. Judge Blackwood dismounted heavily, handing his reins to Reed before climbing the steps to the porch. "Victoria, my dear, I was expecting you in town hours ago." His tone was pleasant, But Jeremiah could hear the underlying threat. Victoria's smile was cool and composed. "Judge Blackwood, Sheriff Taylor, gentlemen, what a surprise! Had I known you were coming, I would have asked Parker to prepare refreshments." She made no move to invite them inside, standing her ground on the porch, with a grace that spoke of her determination. The judge moved closer, lowering his voice. "I think we should continue this conversation privately, don't you? There are matters we need to discuss, urgently." Victoria's gaze flicked briefly to Jeremiah, before returning to Blackwood. "Actually, I believe whatever you have to say can be heard by all present, including Sheriff Taylor." The tension in the air thickened as the judge realized something had changed. His confident demeanor faltered slightly as Victoria reached into her riding jacket and withdrew a small leather portfolio. "I've been doing some accounting today, Henry. Reviewing some of Thomas's old business records that I recently located." The judge's face drained of color. "Victoria, I strongly advise you to consider your next actions very carefully. Business records can be misinterpreted without proper context." She opened the portfolio, removing several folded documents. "These seem quite clear to me. Receipts for rifle shipments to the Sioux, letters arranging payment, and most interestingly, a sworn statement from my husband detailing your partnership in this enterprise, written shortly before his death, almost as if he anticipated you might turn on his family someday." Sheriff Taylor had dismounted and moved closer, his expression growing more concerned as he listened. "Judge, what is Mrs. Thornton talking about?" Blackwood ignored him, his attention fixed on Victoria. "You're making a grave mistake," he hissed. "Those papers prove nothing without Thomas to verify them. It would be your word against mine, the word of a grieving widow, possibly confused by her husband's complex business affairs." Victoria's smile was cold. "Perhaps. Or perhaps there are other witnesses." She looked pointedly at Jeremiah. "Mr. Foster happened to overhear your threats at the courthouse yesterday, and I believe my foreman Martin has some interesting observations about the movements of your men near the site where my ranch hands were killed." The judge's hand moved toward his coat, and for a moment, Jeremiah thought he might draw a hidden weapon. Instead, he simply adjusted his lapel, visibly struggling to regain his composure. "Will," Victoria continued, addressing the sheriff directly, "I'd like to formally request an investigation into Judge Blackwood's involvement in illegal arms trading with the Sioux tribes and the murder of my employees. I'm prepared to turn over all evidence in my possession and testify under oath." Sheriff Taylor looked stunned, his gaze shifting between Victoria and the judge. "Mrs. Thornton, these are serious accusations against a federal judge." Jeremiah stepped forward, his hand casually near his holstered Colt. "They're more than accusations, Will. There's written evidence, and I can testify to what I witnessed at the courthouse. Judge Blackwood has been abusing his position to pressure Mrs. Thornton into signing over valuable water rights. Rights that would give him control of land where evidence of his crimes is hidden." What happened next unfolded with the rapid intensity of a summer storm. The judge lunged forward, trying to grab the documents from Victoria's hand. She stepped back, but not quickly enough to avoid his grasp entirely. As his fingers closed around her wrist, Reed drew. The sheriff's hand went to his own gun, but he was too slow. One of Blackwood's hired guns had him covered before he could draw. Jeremiah, however, had been anticipating trouble. His Colt was in his hand before Reed could shift his aim. The barrel pointed squarely at the gunslinger's chest. "Drop it, Reed," he commanded, his voice carrying the authority of his 20 years as a marshal. This ends now. For a heartbeat that seemed to stretch into eternity, the tableau held. Reed aiming at Taylor, Jeremiah aiming at Reed. The judges hired guns covering both Jeremiah and the sheriff, and Blackwood himself still gripping Victoria's wrist as she struggled to break free. Then the balance shifted. Martin, the ranch foreman, appeared at the corner of the house with a shotgun leveled at the judge's men. Several ranch hands emerged from the barn and bunkhouse, all armed and moving purposefully to surround the group. Reed's eyes darted from side to side, calculating odds that were rapidly turning against him. "It's over, Henry," Victoria said quietly to the judge. "Let go of me and face the consequences of your actions with whatever dignity you have left." For a moment, it seemed Blackwood might resist further, might order his men to open fire despite the hopeless odds. Then, with a sound that was half snarl and half defeated sigh, he released Victoria's wrist and stepped back. Sheriff Taylor recovered quickly, drawing his revolver and ordering Reed to disarm. The gunslinger hesitated, his cold eyes fixed on Jeremiah as if contemplating one final, fatal exchange. "Don't," Jeremiah warned softly. "You're fast, Reed, but not that fast. And dying over another man's crimes seems a poor bargain." Whether it was the logic of Jeremiah's words or the steady hand holding the Colt that convinced him, Reed slowly lowered his weapon and let it drop to the ground. The judge's other men followed suit as the ranch hands closed in around them. Within minutes, Taylor had all 4 men disarmed and lined up on the porch under the watchful eyes of Martin and his cowboys. The sheriff examined the documents Victoria had retrieved, his expression growing grimmer with each page he read. "I'll need to telegraph the territorial governor and the U.S. Marshal's office in Cheyenne," he said finally, looking up at Victoria. "These charges, the evidence, it's going to cause quite a stir." Victoria nodded solemnly. "I understand, but justice must be served, regardless of a man's position or connections." As Taylor began making arrangements to transport his prisoners to the town jail, Victoria drew Jeremiah aside, leading him into the relative privacy of the house. In the shadowed coolness of the entry hall, she turned to face him. "Thank you," she said simply. "I couldn't have done this without you." Jeremiah studied her face, noting the genuine relief in her eyes, but also a wariness that suggested their business wasn't quite concluded. "There's more to this story than you've told me," he said, not accusingly, but with certainty. Victoria sighed, the sound carrying the weight of months of tension and fear. "Yes, Thomas didn't just happen to write that statement before he died. He knew Blackwood was planning to eliminate him, to take control of the ranch and the gun-running operation. My husband wasn't a good man, Mr. Foster, but in his final days, he tried to protect me from his partner." She hesitated, then added, "Thomas didn't die of a heart attack. He was poisoned, slowly, over weeks. By the time I realized what was happening, it was too late to save him. But he left me the means to bring his killer to justice." The revelation settled heavily between them. "You could have told me this from the beginning," Jeremiah said quietly. Victoria met his gaze unflinchingly. "Would you have believed me? A widow accusing a federal judge of murder without proof? I needed you to see Blackwood for what he is with your own eyes before I revealed the full extent of his crimes." There was logic in her reasoning, Jeremiah had to admit. And despite the incomplete information she had provided, her cause had been just. "What will you do now?" he asked. Victoria glanced toward the window, where they could see Sheriff Taylor organizing the departure of his prisoners. "Rebuild. Run this ranch the way it should be run. Honestly." Without blood money or illegal dealings, the Rocking T has good land, good cattle, good men working it. That's enough. She turned back to him, a new vulnerability in her expression. And I hope that once the dust settles on all this, you might consider visiting again. Not as a protector or a witness, but perhaps as a friend. Jeremiah felt an unexpected warmth at her words, a sense of possibility he hadn't experienced in years. "I'd like that," he replied simply. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, casting long shadows across the Rocking T Ranch, Jeremiah stood on the porch, watching the procession of riders disappear down the road toward Promise Creek. Judge Henry Blackwood, Samuel Reed, and their Confederates rode with their hands bound, flanked by Sheriff Taylor and a hastily assembled posse. Justice would take its course now, with the territorial courts and possibly federal authorities sorting through the evidence of gun running, corruption, and murder. Victoria had retreated to her study to compose telegrams to her lawyers and to the governor, preparing for the legal battles that undoubtedly lay ahead. The ranch hands had returned to their duties, the day's drama already becoming stories to be told around bunkhouse fires for years to come. Jeremiah knew he should prepare for his own return journey to his modest horse ranch. But for now, he was content to simply stand in the fading light, reflecting on the strange turns that had brought him back into the world of law and justice he thought he'd left behind. The Wyoming Territory stretched before him, vast and golden in the evening light, a land still wild enough that men like Blackwood could abuse power, still lawless enough in places that justice sometimes required those willing to stand outside official channels. Yet it was changing, too, as railroads and telegraph lines stitched the country together, as towns like Promise Creek grew from dusty crossroads into centers of commerce and civilization. Jeremiah had seen much of that change during his years wearing a marshal's badge, had played his part in bringing order to the frontier. Now, as a private citizen, he had helped right a wrong, not because of any official duty, but because it had been the right thing to do. He heard the door open behind him and turned to find Victoria joining him on the porch, her business concluded for now. They stood side by side, watching the last rays of sunlight painting the distant mountains in shades of purple and gold. "Will you stay for dinner?" she asked, her voice softer than he had heard it before. "Parker is preparing something special to celebrate our success." Jeremiah considered the invitation, weighing his desire to return to the solitude of his own home against the unexpected connection he felt with this complicated woman. "I'd be honored," he replied finally. As they turned to enter the house together, Jeremiah reflected that sometimes seeing what no one was meant to see led to unexpected journeys, and perhaps, just perhaps, to new beginnings as well. The old lawman and the widow walked into the warm light of the Thornton home, leaving the shadows of the past behind them, at least for one evening. If you like this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions of this story in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box on the left.